In the years after World War II, across the Pacific Islands, across occupied Europe, across military depots from Texas to Tennessee, the United States government quietly destroyed an unknown but staggering number of perfectly functional rifles, weapons that had taken years to design and millions of man-hours to build, weapons that had never been fired in combat. Some were melted down in industrial furnaces, some were cut apart with acetylene torches, some were loaded onto barges and dropped into the sea. On islands like Guam and Tinian, bulldozers simply crushed entire pallets of crated small arms into the coral rather than ship them home. Nobody made public announcements. There were no press conferences. In many cases, there were no records at all. This was not negligence, it was policy. Across the United States and among its allies, governments were making deliberate decisions to remove millions of surplus military rifles from the world, and the reasons behind those decisions are stranger, more tangled, and more consequential than most history books have ever acknowledged. This is the story of what really happened to the guns that won the war, and why the people in power wanted them gone. To understand why governments feared these weapons so deeply, you first have to understand what they represented. The Second World War had militarized the world in a way that had never happened before and has never happened since. By 1945, the United States alone had placed a rifle or carbine in the hands of over 12 million men. Britain, the Soviet Union, Germany, France, Japan, each had done the same. Entire industrial economies had been retooled for a single purpose: to produce weapons faster than the other side could destroy them. The numbers are staggering even now. American factories produced over 6 million M1 Garand rifles during the war, a weapon General George Patton himself called the greatest battle implement ever devised. The Springfield Armory, the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, the International Harvester Corporation, facilities that once built sewing machines and farm equipment, were now stamping out precision military instruments by the tens of thousands per week. Add to that the M1 carbine, with production reaching nearly 30,000 per day by the war's final months, and you begin to sense the sheer industrial weight of what had been created. Britain had its own arsenal, Lee Enfields by the millions, produced in factories from Birmingham to Calcutta. The Soviet Union had the Mosin Nagant, churned out from the armories at Tula and Izhevsk in numbers that defy imagination. Historians estimate over 17 million produced between 1941 and 1945 alone. Germany, even as it collapsed in the final months of the war, was still producing Kar 98K rifles in underground factories staffed by forced labor. By May of 1945, when the guns finally fell silent in Europe, the world was drowning in weapons. The immediate post-war period was not the clean, triumphant era that newsreel footage would have you believe. Yes, there were parades. Yes, there were sailors kissing strangers in Times Square. But behind the celebrations, military planners and government officials were facing a problem that kept them awake at night. There were simply too many guns. Not just rifles, artillery pieces, machine guns, pistols, ammunition by the billion rounds. But rifles were a particular concern because rifles were portable, concealable, durable, and lethal in the hands of a single motivated person. And in 1945 and 1946, the world was full of motivated people. Europe was in ruins, governments had collapsed across the continent, old empires were fracturing at the seams. In France, in Italy, in Greece, communist and nationalist movements were battling for power, sometimes in the streets. In Southeast Asia, independence movements that had been quietly simmering for decades were now openly armed, many equipped with weapons captured from the Japanese or received from Allied supply drops during the war. In China, a civil war that had been paused during the Japanese occupation was resuming with terrifying momentum. American policymakers looked at this landscape and saw a nightmare. Millions of surplus rifles seeping into the black market, flowing into the hands of revolutionary groups, fueling insurgencies across 3 continents. Declassified post-war planning documents reveal an acute anxiety among senior officials about unsecured military materiel in the hands of unstabilizing forces. The concern was not abstract. It was operational, immediate, and growing by the week. The guns had to disappear. The question was how. The first and most straightforward solution was storage. The U.S. Army inherited massive depot facilities, places like the Letterkenny Army Depot in Pennsylvania, the Red River Arsenal in Texas, and the Rock Island Arsenal in Illinois. These facilities could hold hundreds of thousands of weapons in climate-controlled conditions, properly preserved and catalogued, ready for reissue if needed. But storage was expensive. The cost of maintaining rifles in long-term preservation, the Cosmoline treatments, the inventory management, the security requirements, the ongoing facility overhead, added up quickly, and Congress found it increasingly difficult to justify as the country rushed to demobilize. Politicians who had been asking the American people to sacrifice for 4 years were now eager to announce peace dividends, not ongoing military expenditures for weapons that might never be needed again. And so a sprawling, largely uncoordinated process of disposal unfolded across multiple theaters simultaneously, sometimes bureaucratically managed, sometimes chaotic, sometimes nothing more than exhausted GIs doing whatever was fastest. In the Pacific, the destruction was immediate and visceral. On islands like Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, staging grounds for the invasion of Japan that never came, warehouses stacked floor to ceiling with crated rifles were crushed by bulldozers or pushed into the sea. Veterans who witnessed these operations described a kind of surreal exhaustion to the whole affair. Nobody was celebrating. Nobody felt particularly good about it. The equipment had been built to fight a war that was now over, and the quickest path home ran straight through destruction. One veteran, interviewed decades later for an oral history archive, described watching military equipment being destroyed on a Pacific island after the surrender. "You tried not to think about it too hard," he said. "You just wanted to get home." In Europe, the calculus was different, but the outcome was often the same. The Allied occupation forces faced a unique problem. The continent was littered not just with American and British surplus, but with the weapons of defeated armies. German Kar 98K rifles, collected from surrendering soldiers, were stacked in fields and barnyards across occupied Germany and Austria. Luger pistols, MP40 submachine guns, Sturmgewehr 44 assault rifles, weapons that would become collectors' treasures in later decades, were being treated as rubble to be cleared. The official policy was destruction or controlled redistribution. In practice, control was difficult to maintain. Senior American officers, under enormous pressure from Washington to demobilize and ship their men home as fast as possible, often defaulted to whatever solution was simplest. Weapons that couldn't be quickly catalogued and transferred were destroyed on site. Teams of ordnance soldiers worked through the winter of 1945 and into 1946, collecting small arms from farms, attics, and roadside dumps where retreating Wehrmacht soldiers had abandoned them. Mountains of rifles, German, Italian, French, Polish, Czech, were hauled to collection points. Some were transferred to the newly forming West German police forces or handed to Allied governments. Most were not. The furnaces and the cutting torches were faster. The scale of loss, in terms of material, in terms of history, in terms of things that could never be recovered, was enormous. But at the time, nobody was thinking about history. They were thinking about the next 5 years, about what happens when a continent in chaos is swimming in rifles. Back in Washington, other pressures were building. The United States had always been a country with deep civilian traditions around firearms, a long history of veterans keeping service weapons, of surplus military arms flowing into civilian hands, of shooting clubs and state militias maintaining their own arsenals. After the First World War, the government had distributed large quantities of surplus rifles through civilian programs. Many Americans expected the same would happen again after the second, and some of those rifles did reach civilian hands. The Civilian Marksmanship Program, a government initiative dating back to 1903, distributed surplus M1 Garands to qualified civilian shooters in the post-war years, but the volumes involved were a small fraction of what was actually available. The question of what happened to the rest opens a door into the more complicated politics of post-war demobilization. The government's decisions were shaped by competing pressures that were difficult to balance openly. Storage costs and logistical constraints were real and significant. Foreign military aid commitments, which would soon become the primary channel for disposing of surplus arms, were growing. And there were genuine concerns about the Thompson submachine gun precedent. After the First World War, surplus military automatic weapons had flowed into civilian markets and ended up in the hands of criminal organizations. The gangs of the 1920s and 1930s had armed themselves, in part, with government surplus. Nobody wanted a second chapter to that story. There were also commercial pressures, though how heavily they influenced policy is a matter of historical debate. American firearms manufacturers were rebuilding their peacetime production lines after years of government contracts and a massive flood of cheap government surplus rifles into the civilian market would have posed real competition. Whether that commercial interest formally translated into lobbying pressure against civilian surplus sales, or whether the government's decisions were driven primarily by strategic and logistical factors, remains difficult to establish precisely from the archival record. The result, regardless of the reasons, was a policy implemented with remarkable consistency across multiple agencies. Surplus rifles in large quantities would not be sold on the domestic civilian market. They would be stored in depots, transferred to overseas allies, or destroyed. And what was destroyed would be destroyed quietly, without public announcements. The Cold War dimension of this story is perhaps the least examined and most consequential, because not all of those surplus American rifles were destroyed. A very significant portion were redistributed, not to American civilians, but to governments and forces overseas that the United States wanted to strengthen against communist influence. Greece, fighting a communist insurgency that would eventually draw direct American military involvement under the Truman Doctrine, received large shipments of American surplus weapons beginning in 1947. South Korea received American arms as the occupying U.S. forces sought to build a viable South Korean military. Nationalist Chinese forces, French colonial armies in Indochina, emerging anti-communist governments across Southeast Asia, all received weapons from American surplus stockpiles in the late 1940s. Some of those rifles would remain in service for decades. Some ended up in conflicts that Americans would later join, fighting on the same side as weapons they had once carried, or sometimes against them. As arms transferred to one faction found their way into other hands through capture, black market sale, or the fog of insurgency. The M1 Garand rifles that American ordnance officers shipped to South Korea in the late 1940s were still in service when American soldiers arrived in 1950. They were carrying them through the same frozen hills and river valleys where American infantrymen were dying. The same weapon, handed off from one set of hands to another, still at war, still doing the work it had been made to do, just not the war anyone had originally imagined. It was not a comfortable thing to contemplate. And perhaps that discomfort explains, in part, why the full story of post-war weapons disposal has never quite made it into the standard histories. The historical record of exactly how many rifles were destroyed in the post-war years is fragmentary and contested. Official documentation was incomplete to begin with, and what records existed were scattered across dozens of different commands, depots, and theaters. Some were never filed at all. What is documented, in Army ordnance reports, in congressional testimony about surplus property disposal, in the records of post-war demobilization commissions, makes clear that the destruction was real, widespread, and enormous in scale. Millions of rifles, certainly. The precise figure may never be established. What is perhaps more important than the numbers is what those numbers represent. These were not obsolete weapons. They were not broken or beyond repair. Many had never been fired. They were the products of the greatest industrial mobilization in American history, built by workers who had sacrificed wages and comfort and normalcy for years to produce them. They were the instruments of a victory that changed the world. And they were gone. Among those destroyed were weapons of genuine historical significance, early production models, rare variants, rifles with documented provenance that firearms historians and collectors would have treasured. They went into the furnaces and the sea with everything else. The logic was that the value of stability outweighed the value of preservation, that a rifle sitting in a foreign insurgent's hands was more dangerous than a rifle sitting in a museum. That calculation may have been correct. That's the thing that makes this history so difficult to sit with. The people who made those decisions were not careless or malicious. They were confronting a genuinely dangerous post-war world with limited options and immense pressure to act quickly. The destruction of millions of rifles was, in its own dark way, an act intended to preserve peace. But peace has its costs too, and one of them was paid in history, in the slow, quiet erasure of artifacts that could never be replaced, decided in offices and depots far from public scrutiny, by men who were not thinking about what anyone would want to know 50 years later. Today, when a collector pays thousands of dollars for an original M1 Garand at auction, when a museum displays a rack of Lee Enfields behind glass as relics of a vanished world, it is worth pausing to consider how many of their counterparts no longer exist, how many rifles that could have connected a grandson to his grandfather's war were instead fed into a furnace or cut apart with a torch or sunk in a Pacific lagoon. The men who made those decisions were operating under real pressures, with real fears, in a world that had just spent 6 years drowning in violence and was terrified of drowning again. The logic of destruction was, in its own dark way, a logic of peace. Remove the weapons, and perhaps the world becomes a little less dangerous. It was a calculation that reasonable people could make. But calculations have costs, and the cost here was paid not in blood, but in memory, in the slow erasure of the physical record of a war that shaped everything about the world we live in today, in the quiet decisions made in offices and depots and on tropical islands that some things were better disposed of than preserved. The rifles are gone. Most of them, anyway. The ones that survived did so by accident, by luck, by the intervention of a collector or curator, or an ordnance officer who simply couldn't bring himself to follow the order all the way through. They are the survivors of a second kind of reckoning, not the one fought with bullets, but the one fought with policy and logistics and institutional indifference to what would one day be called heritage. And every time you see one in a museum case, or feel the weight of one in your hands, know that it is carrying the memory of millions more that never made it home. If this story made you think differently about the history you thought you knew, consider sharing it with someone who'd want to hear it. And if you want more hidden stories from the corners of World War II history that the textbooks forgot, subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from.